Welcome back to the show, or if this is your first time, welcome to the Longevity Podcast. My name is Natalie Nidham, and I am so excited to have you here. We have an amazing show for you today, and I want to start by thanking you, the listeners. Whether you're just new to the show or you've been with me for a long time, I couldn't do it without you guys. Obviously, without you, the audience, giving me feedback, telling me what you love, telling me what you want more of, telling me sometimes what I could be doing better, I'd be nowhere. So thank you for being here. Thank you for all your feedback, comments, and questions. Thanks for your support. And I just want to tell you guys how much I appreciate you. And I'd love to invite you to check out my website, natnidham.com. That is where you can sign up for the newsletter. You can learn more about the membership community. You can check out the Nat Recommend section because that's where all that's where all the links and codes to the products that I really love and love to share with my audience lives. There's so much to explore over there. And that's it. If you're feeling inspired today, make sure that you share this episode. This is a very powerful episode today. I mean, look, they're all informative. They're all great. This one, when I recorded, it made me really sit and think. I think it's the kind of thing that we all really need to put more thought into. So I'm really excited to hear what you think about the episode if you love it as much as I do. Okay, let's talk about this episode. If you've been struggling with chronic health issues that conventional medicine can't seem to solve, we've got to start thinking about things differently. What if brain retraining was the answer? What if the answer lies in your brain and not in your body? This is what I dive into in this episode with special guest Ashok Gupta. We discuss the root causes of chronic diseases, the impact of stress on the nervous system, and the importance of regulating that nervous system for overall health and longevity. Now, if you've been listening to these podcasts, you know this is a thing. We also discuss medical studies on the power of the mind and spirit in healing chronic diseases, conventional and holistic approaches to healthcare, as well as the role of trauma in shaping our responses to stress. In all, we dive into the technique of brain retraining with the Gupta Program, along with the power of meditation, as well as relaxation techniques. The founder of the Gupta Program is Ashok Gupta himself, and he uses his 25 years of research combined with the latest findings about neuroplasticity and brain retraining techniques to reverse conditions that are ultimately caused by misfirings, if you will, in the brain function. Now, to find out more about Ashok Gupta, was a tremendous guest. I know you guys are going to love him. All you want to do is go to the website guptaprogram.com. That's Gupta program.com. And you can even download their free app on the Apple Store or on Google Play. All right, now let's jump into the episode. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Welcome to the show, Ashok Gupta. It is such a pleasure to have you here today. I know it's taken us a little while to make this happen.
Natalie, thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about this conversation. We spend so much time talking about, supplements and modalities and gizmos and gadgets. And, for me, this conversation around how do we tap into the power of our mind and our spirit, maybe, to really affect change still at a physiological level, but at a cellular level in a different way, is the ultimate conversation around longevity. So thank you so much for being willing to be here and talk to us about it today.
Yeah, I'm excited. Absolutely. I think just from the conversation we had initially, there's some exciting things that we can discuss.
Yeah. So where do we begin? I mean, let's start with you. Let's talk about you and how, because the Gupta, it's the Gupta method, right? That is your flagship offering, let's say.
Yes.
The Gupta Program. So let's talk a bit about you and because you're not coming to us from conventional medicine, thank goodness. That's probably why you've seen the world the way you have and developed the tools that you have. But let's talk a little bit about you and how you've come into this space.
Like many of us who work with people who really have that urge to kind of relieve people's suffering, it started from my own suffering. So this was the mid-90s, and I was studying as an undergrad at Cambridge University. And suddenly I had this virus, didn't think much of it. The virus went away. But I seemed to start feeling a lot worse. And my health just degraded, to the point at which I was so exhausted I couldn't even walk. I would open up a textbook and I couldn't read the words on the textbook. I had to crawl to the bathroom sometimes. I couldn't sleep at night. Everything in my whole mind and body just seemed to be completely malfunctioning. And I'd go from doctor to doctor and they would say, we don't know what you have. We don't know what to call it. We have no treatment for it. You might have this for the rest of your life. Goodbye. And I met hundreds of others who were also suffering in a similar way. And in my darkest moments, I was almost suicidal because in the early mid-90s, these conditions weren't really recognized. They weren't really talked about. And they gave it a label of ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay. But that in itself didn't really help because there was no treatment for it. And I remember in my darkest moment, having met hundreds of people with the condition, I thought, if I can just get myself 30% better, 50% better, if I can just have some standard of living, some quality of life, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with this condition because such an awful experience. And I happened to come across then the work of Professor Joseph Ledoux, who was in the 90s the foremost expert on some of the neurological reactions that we have to condition responses, fear responses, PTSD, etc. And I looked at a lot of his work and I applied that to a whole different area of medicine, which was these types of chronic diseases, and came up with a hypothesis as to what might be causing these illnesses. And in an ad hoc way, I retrained my brain, literally just experimenting with different techniques. I managed to get myself 100% well. And then I published my medical hypothesis online in 1999, and then in a medical hypothesis journal in 2002, and then set up a clinic to help others, and worked for many years one-on-one to try and understand what are these techniques, how can we refine them to see what works for most people. And then I published the first Neuroplasticity program in 2007. And since then, we've been running clinical trials, RCTs, randomized control trials. We now have an app. So yeah, that's been our journey over the last 25 years. And it's been a fascinating journey. And I've learned so much, I've expanded so much. So what at the time seemed like an awful experience has been the biggest gift to me and my life, even though I couldn't see it at the time.
Isn't that so often the case? I find that fascinating. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit because, you contracted a virus, you just got sicker and sicker and sicker. Certainly in this day and age, this is not an uncommon occurrence. The last 4 years have taught us that a virus can really kick the daylights out of people, and that conventional medicine doesn't have a lot to offer people who have these post-viral syndromes, we'll call them for lack of a better term. And the truth of the matter is, I think what's happened over the last 4 years is there's more of them, but they've always been around. This has always happened. Like viruses have always had the ability somehow to create some degree of deep dysregulation in the body that's prevented the human body from resetting itself in a sense. So I don't know if you want to talk specifically to that event in your case. We'll stop short of making sweeping recommendations, but because there might be a physiological issue as well concurrently. But I think that what's so, and we were talking about this before the episode, whereas people may come to neuroplasticity training and this kind of work as a last resort, how amazing would it be if people did this work first? Or maybe I would imagine there's even a use case scenario for doing this type of work before you're even sick, like when you're well, and just optimizing your nervous system so that you can be more well, like better.
So you hit the nail on the head that we are really a sickness industry, and people come to us only when they're really sick, but we can prevent these things from happening if we can regulate people's nervous systems as a preventative measure. And in fact, your vision is very similar to what our vision is, which is in 5 to 10 years' time, we want neuroplasticity and brain retraining to be the first thing that your doctor recommends for all these chronic diseases that we're seeing in the population, because there's a body of evidence behind it. So we've already published 3 randomized controlled trials. We've got more in the pipeline. So for us, it's building that body of evidence that makes it a no-brainer, pardon the pun, that this is the thing that people should be doing in their lives. And to answer your question, like what causes these conditions? Where do they come from? What is the reason for why I got ill and lots of people get ill? And remember, we're talking about a whole range of different diseases. So there's neuroimmune diseases that are ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID. We all know lots of people who suffer from long COVID. They estimate in the US, 10 to 20 million people may be having long COVID. And then fibromyalgia, pain syndromes, and then the sensitivity reactions. So mold illness, even Lyme disease as opportunistic infections, food and chemical sensitivities. I mean, everyone these days seems to have a food sensitivity.
Yeah, or MCAS, like mast cell activate. Like to me, like mast cell activation syndrome, it's like strikes the fear into people's heart, right? Or the other one that's really crazy is cell danger response. When I had a client once tell me, "Oh, my doctor told me I'm stuck in cell danger response," and I was like, "Oh my God, that sounds awful. What are we going to do?" How do we talk to your cells and get them to calm down?
These diagnoses don't necessarily, they help because they actually make something more concrete and something we know what's wrong now, but they don't necessarily help in terms of curatively, what do we do as a next step? And so all of these different diseases we call neuroimmune conditioned syndromes, and I'll come on to why we call them that. But they are different families of illnesses, including pain syndromes as well. But ultimately, we believe that the root cause is in the brain, not the body. And the reason medicine has looked at the body is because medicine is about what can be measured. So the brain until 20 years ago was a black box. We couldn't look inside the brain and figure out what was going on. So we said, well, we can measure enzymes, we can measure chemicals in the body. So let's go to the reductionist state and fix the downstream issues. And hopefully that will be curative. But actually, the way I look at that is it's imagining you're standing on a bridge and there's people drowning in the water. So you think, oh my gosh, I need to jump in and save them. So you save one person. And then there's another person drowning. So you jump in and you try valiantly to pull them out of the water. And you do this repeatedly for years and you set up a rescue center. But nobody's asking the question, who's throwing these people into the river in the first place? Why is the body
such a good question?
Why is we getting these types of illnesses? And let's go further upstream. And the most upstream that I believe we can go is the brain, the unconscious brain. And that, I believe, is at the root cause of so many illnesses. So, Natalie, I'd love to share with you my hypothesis, because then this will frame it into the following questions that you have.
Please do.
Let's start with the biggest question of all. Why are we here? Right? Now, I'd love to have a philosophical and spiritual chat with you the next half an hour on that, but let's stick to the science. So let's say from a scientific perspective, why are we here? We're here because this nervous system, which is the electrical information highway of your body, and this physiology has evolved over millions of years, from plant life to single-cell organisms to invertebrates to vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings. And our DNA contains that lineage. So a fascinating stat, our DNA contains 40% of the same DNA as a banana. Like, isn't that incredible?
I love it.
So our system has learned to adapt to harsh environments. We are survival machines. And so we adapt to the environment, we survive, we procreate, and then we pass on our genes to the next generation. So from a scientific perspective, we're here because we can survive. And that gives us the first jigsaw piece of these chronic illnesses. The brain's number one priority is survival, not wellness. The brain doesn't care whether you feel well, it cares whether you survive. So that's our number one clue. Then the second clue as to what causes these illnesses is that we're not living according to our genetic inheritance. So for most of our evolution, we lived in small communities, we were outdoors, we were fresh air, we ate food that wasn't poisoned. And now fast forward to the last couple of 100 years, especially the last 50 years or so, we live in boxes, we don't spend much time outdoors, we're in light and getting our vitamin D. We eat food which has high levels of toxins, pesticides, etc. We have high levels of stress. We're sedentary. We don't move as much as we need to. And we then sit in front of screens, stressing out our nervous system. And not only that, then comparing ourselves to everybody else on the planet. So we literally are...
Especially that one.
We're literally breeding people to have anxiety, depression, and physical illness as a result of this. So that's our second piece, is that this nervous system is now getting more threats. So there's more threats than we used to have in previous generations. Now, let's take the example of an illness. Let's take COVID. We've talked about COVID. So let's say COVID comes along, and our system normally fights off the COVID infection and then goes back to normal. But if the system is stressed out, and that isn't just emotional stress or mental stress, that can be physical stress, physical burnout, overtraining. It can be a whole host of different things. The system then goes into an alternate state where it says, okay, I'm going to fight off this virus. It fights it off, but it isn't sure if it's fully fought it off. So it errs on the side of caution and continues the defensive response. So let me give you an example. So Natty, are you a fan of Game of Thrones by any chance? Oh, you love Game of Thrones. You love Game of Thrones. Okay, good.
I mean, I may or may not have hid my face a few times, but, I love the show.
And if people listening aren't fans of Game of Thrones, you can just say a fairy tale. Let's say we take a fairy tale. And imagine that, Natalie, you are queen of your kingdom. You are Queen Natalie. Okay. That has a nice ring to it. So you're Queen Natalie of your kingdom and your castle. And you have an army, which is your nervous system, which defends the kingdom. And you have your navy, which is your immune system, which also defends the kingdom. The nervous system does it through the information flows and the electrical movement of your body. And then the immune system does it through the chemicals that fight off viruses, infections, etc. Now, imagine an army comes over the hill. Your army and navy are galvanized, they're ready, they're strong, they fight off that COVID virus, and your system comes back to balance within a week or a couple of weeks. But imagine there's a drought in the kingdom. There's a weakness. And that drought could be ongoing stress, chronic stress, it could be physically overdoing it, could be just overcoming a previous infection, etc. So your system is weak. Now, the army and navy have a threat coming over the hill. So in terms of COVID or long COVID, it is the COVID infection. In terms of ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, it's often a virus or bacterial infection. In terms of mold illness, it's a mold exposure. Lyme, it's Lyme disease, Lyme infection. Then in the case of pain, you may have been injured or had an accident, which then threatens the system with pain signals. So your army and navy now are fighting off this incoming invader. Let's say it's COVID. And they fight it off, but because they're weaker, it takes longer for them to fight off. So that's when we have a virus infection. We know when we're feeling weak, it takes ages to fight off that infection. And then we have a lingering cough or post-viral fatigue afterwards because our system has been shocked.
Yeah.
And the reason it's continuing with that immune response is because it wants to absolutely make sure it's fought off the invader, and it isn't sure. And so the army and navy are absolutely exhausted from fighting off the COVID infection or the invader. So they come to you, their weekly meeting with Queen Natalie, and they say, Queen Natalie, we are the generals of the army and navy. We're not sure if we fought off the invader because they might be hiding in the forest. Therefore, we need all the resources because the kingdom's weak right now. And if the kingdom falls, everything is lost. So we are the priority. Give us all the resources. We need the clean water, the food, the metal, the corn, everything. So that gets channeled to the army and navy. And now, because they are so traumatized by war, just like war veterans are, they keep firing off their weapons of war, which is the immune system, the inflammatory response, inflaming the body, inflaming the brain. And now if a man on a horse comes over the hill, it's not threatening, but they will fire off their weapons of war just in case. And then what happens, some of those arrows start falling accidentally back into the kingdom, which then you get the inflammatory response in the body, you get the autoimmune effects in the body as well. And not only that, normally we have a secret service that fights off spies. But because that's not being funded anymore, opportunistic infections start flourishing. So viruses, bacteria, etc., mycotoxin, they all start flourishing in the body. And now we have this dysregulated state where the army, the nervous system, is overstimulated. The immune system is overstimulated, which then causes ongoing exhaustion, which may actually be characterized as the opposite of a sympathetic response. It could be seen as a parasympathetic response because there is no energy anymore.
There's nothing left.
The tank is empty. And the body's becoming more and more inflamed, which means the system is becoming weaker. So the kingdom is becoming weaker. And the weaker it gets, the more traumatized the army and navy generals become, saying we need more resources, more resources. So they start triggering more of the immune system and nervous system, creating more symptoms in the body, which feed back to the brain. And we get caught in a vicious cycle. The brain says we're in danger, triggers immune and nervous system responses, creates symptoms in the body, looping back to a hypersensitive brain, and around we go. And brain retraining is the next time that you have your weekly meeting with the Army and Navy generals. They say, Natalie, we're in danger. Keep giving us the resources. You say, my dear generals, you have done a valiant job in protecting the kingdom, but the war is over. You can stand down. And the first time you tell them that, they won't understand the message because, how can this even be true? This is nonsense. Maybe it's a trick. And they won't listen. But the purpose of neuroplasticity is repetition. That as you keep training the brain that we are safe, eventually Army and Navy generals, they stand down and the whole system comes back to its regulated state. And once it's back in parasympathetic regulation, or certainly balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, the detoxification systems can kick back in. Your natural immunity becomes strong. Your nervous system comes back to balance. So you're no longer feeling stressed and anxious. And the whole system gets back to its optimal state for healing itself. And often a lot of our patients, when they go through this brain retraining, they will train their brain. And after a few weeks, they'll go, Ashok, I'm having intense exhaustion. I don't know why. But it's not the exhaustion I had before, but it's an intense, I just want to sleep for 10 days. I say, good. Your system is finally getting to balance. The parasympathetic is saying, now I want to heal. I want to rest. I want to digest. And it's indicating to you that you just need to sleep this off and have really lots and lots of sleep to enable the repair to occur that wasn't occurring when you weren't sleeping well. And they say, okay, all right, I trust you on that. And they wait until that phase goes, and suddenly all the energy comes back to their system because it finally got the rest it needed. So that is the hypothesis in a nutshell.
That's a really cool hypothesis. I love that hypothesis because it accounts for even things like, and you mentioned these, these co-infections, right? So Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, like these are viruses that, however we want to call it, kind of they coexist. They live in the community. They're not a problem because they're kept in check, but they exist here. But to use your analogy, when the armies are distracted with what they perceive to be a bigger threat on the outside, this is where we see people saying, my Lyme reactivated or my EBV reactivated because there's another bigger threat, whether it's COVID or mold or whatever the case may be, that allows these things to come back up again. And it's in that dysregulation of the system that you're no longer able to keep the peace.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And what happens is, let's take the example of COVID. When we had COVID come along, there was a lot of anxiety in the population. We knew that anxiety levels went through the roof. Depression levels went through the roof because of the situation. And that primed the pump of the brain that that we were already stressed, that when the chronic disease then came along, we had it, we were even more frightened. And that then set the system up to hyper defend even once the virus had gone, which is why we see so many people with long COVID.
Yeah, no, that's quite something. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I mean, we talked a little bit about this, but let's take long COVID, for example. So there's definitely measurable metrics that people have started to be able to associate with long COVID. And so just for the person who's listening on the other side, who's like, so wait a minute, you're telling me that I don't need to take any medicine. I don't need to take any supplements. All I need to do is get out of my head or, calm down my brain. And this is all magically going to disappear. Like, is there, you know what I mean? Like, is there an intersection of and I don't want to call it allopathic because allopathic in this situation seems to be at a bit of a loss, right? And we talked a little bit before the podcast where we said, even in the functional and space, there's a lot of practitioners getting kind of sucked into an allopathic model where they're looking for what's the supplement, what's the technique or tool we're going to apply. They're still not looking at the nervous system regulation kind of thing. But is there a place where people need to do both, or and I would say if we're going to talk about a chicken or the egg scenario, my guess is the answer is there is a chicken or the egg, right? And whatever one you want to call it, the first one, it has to start in the brain. But I'm going to let you kind of go with that. Lots of interesting
questions there. So I think the first port of call is yes. I think in functional and integrative doctors, and we work with a lot of them, we have now around 5,000 medical practitioners in the US who are now recommending our program as a complement to their existing protocols. But yes, a lot of it has become quite reductionist, where we do a whole set of tests and we say, right, that's out of kilter, that's not quite right, now we need to correct that with this. And so it's becoming quite reductionist. And I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying it's not the whole picture. And we have a both and model, which is, if your system is dysregulated, yes, its absorption of nutrients is going to be reduced. The gut capacity is going to be reduced. There's going to be dysbiosis. And so if you do take medications and supplements to support your body in this altered state, that can only be of benefit. So we're not against that. But what we also say to our patients is, we don't want you to then only think that that's the route to wellness, but let's go further upstream and come to the root source as well. So do both, but really, make sure that you have a belief in the brain retraining, because if you don't, then you're just going to go back to that more reductionist model again. And so a lot of practitioners, naturopathic doctors and integrative functional doctors, nutritionists, they now see the nervous system regulation, the brain retraining as an important part, and they include it as part of their protocols, and they get better outcomes when they get clients who successfully use it or choose to use it. And so that's our both and model. And I think in terms of the chicken and egg, which one comes first? In my view, it starts off as a slow rhythm. So let's say we're at baseline, body's good, brain is good. Naturally, we have stress in our lives. And in previous generations, we have short bouts of stress that we would manage, and we would have support groups. Whereas in the modern world, we have almost continual chronic stress in the way that we live life. And the moment that we've actually going to take a rest, guess what? We look at a screen. We look at our phones or iPads, which we think is a distraction or numbing us or helping us. But actually, it's re-stimulating the nervous system, because it's a lean forward experience. It's not like watching television, which is can be relaxing if you're lean back, but looking at a screen and activating things within that screen is a lean forward experience. So that means the system is chronically stressed, which makes us more prone to these types of illnesses coming. And that means that we have a dysregulation up in the brain, which then causes dysregulation in terms of the gut, so more inflammation. So we know that stress is inflammatory, so we then inflame the gut slightly. That then, through the gut-brain axis, feeds back to the brain that there's something wrong, which can then support aspects of chronic overthinking or anxiety and depression, which then makes this brain think we're more in danger, which then can stimulate the gut. So then once again, we get into that chicken and egg, and we start into a vicious cycle. But yes, in my view, it's not that the body randomly goes wrong. The gut doesn't just suddenly randomly go wrong. Because if it does, we could say X plus Y equals Z. Every person who eats that food is going to have this dysregulation. Or everyone who's in a moldy environment is definitely going to react in this way. Now, it's a learnt defensive reaction. And because we're survival machines, the brain will always find new things to defend against when it's in a dysregulated state.
Yeah. I think you bring up such an important point. And, what it brings to mind is, we've got a fairly large and growing population of people right now that are obsessed with living a long life, with having health span, with living really well down the road. And every once in a while, you run across people who say, oh, yeah, well, that's interesting because my grandmother is 90-something years old. They've been smoking and drinking their whole lives, and they're actually kicking butt right now. And I think that there's a tendency to say, oh, well, they're outliers, they're weird, whatever. But I actually think that those are the people we need to look at to see, how is that possible? How is it possible? And, for sure, they probably have detoxification pathways that are optimized. And in this day and age, we could say that when they were born and they initially evolved in a different environment than we were in, I think that social media has upped the ante on nervous system activation in a way that humanity has never. I mean, short of living in a war with bombs falling all around you all the time, there's nothing that comes close to this perpetual noise.
Absolutely.
If you will.
I think that's exactly right. We are living in a chronically stressed society. And people I speak to in the street, people I speak to, my clients, everyone seems to be on the edge. They're just on the edge of a nervous breakdown. They're just on the edge of burnout, and they're just about managing to cope with a number of stimuli. because we have access to this World Wide Web, we feel that we should maximize that. And in doing so, we have information overload. And this small little brain of ours can't handle that capacity. It doesn't have the capacity to handle so much stimulation, you know. And I think in terms of longevity, that's the thing. You see, we're so focused on, right, health span, longevity, what supplements do I need to take, what medications, etc. We're not realizing that actually the mind aspect, the brain aspect is absolutely crucial. The sociological aspect is crucial. The movement aspect is crucial. And when we look at the blue zones and the 9, 10, 11 criteria there, only a few of them are purely related to diet and those things. A lot of them are more related to the way you interact with others, the way you feel about life, how you take responsibility for your own happiness. And as you say, that is why when you look at people who've lived many, many years, it's very few that will say, oh, there was a biohacker. He lived to 120 because he took all these great supplements. No, those people who lived to past 100, they tended to be people, like we know with the blue zone criteria, that had those social connections, that didn't take life too seriously, who were a bit more happy-go-lucky, didn't stimulate their nervous system. And so I would say, if people want to live a longer life, start with regulating your nervous system as a primary driver of degradation of your telomeres and your DNA.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, and if you think about it, what is one of the ways to lengthen telomeres is meditation.
Exactly right. Yeah.
It's free, right? It's not even a bioregulator. I mean, I talk about bioregulator peptides a lot. You can take a bioregulator for that, but as it turns out, there's a clinical trial that another guest of mine is conducting, and he's got a cohort of over 100 people, and they're taking all these bioregulators, and many of them are having good results. There's a couple of people in that cohort that have not budged. And when I asked him why, he said, because those two people are under such crazy stress that their system is literally stuck. Even with the external inputs that should reset the system, it's not moving. There's no movement. Like, it's not happening. They're kind of stuck. And so I think that, one of the reasons I was so excited about this recording, talking to you is exactly this. I think that I obviously want to talk about people with serious health conditions that can make progress in ways that they could never imagine, really, by doing this neuroplasticity work. But I'm one of these things, as I've, repositioned the podcast to be a longevity podcast, I want us to keep this perspective. I want us to remember that doing this kind of work is really what's going to potentially allow us to get to where we want to go, which is to live this full, healthy, amazing life. It's not going to come out of a bottle. And taking on this practice, because I would imagine it's a practice. I haven't done the neuroplasticity training yet, and I hope to at some point, probably sooner than later, from the sounds of it. This is what's going to allow us to really travel a trajectory with ease, rather than trying to battle our way to the end.
I think what you're describing is that vision and dream of true holistic health versus people paying lip service to it and really saying there are so many factors to our health and longevity. Let's look at all of these. And ultimately, keeping a happy state of mind, I think, is the ultimate one. And that is far more involved and complex than popping a pill or popping a supplement. Those things, of course, no doubtedly can help, but it's up here where the real action happens. And I give you an example. I have, I have a busy clinic. I have numerous different things that I run, and it's very busy. And so when I'm in my office and I'm working, sure, I have to make sure I exercise. I'll do my meditation every day. I will make sure I'm eating well to keep my health and my energy levels good. And so I'm biohacking all of that, as we might call it. But then I go on holiday and I'm relaxed. I can eat fried foods. I can eat all kinds of nonsense. I can just sleep for 4 or 5 hours a night. I can not take care of my health. And I've got loads of energy. I'm fine. Right? And you'll get that, right? We all know somebody in our lives that, perhaps eats junk food, doesn't really look after their health, does none of the good stuff we all know we should be doing. and yet they're fine and happy and great, and they're lots of energy and living their lives. And we think, wow, what is it that they've got? And ultimately, my belief is that it comes down to nervous system regulation. And this often, in terms of what differentiates different levels of nervous system regulation, I think we were talking earlier about this, that is decided from a number of different factors. So it can be, first of all, the stress that the mother experienced during gestation. So that's the first criteria. Then secondly, the potential harmful toxins and whatever that the mother was taking during gestation. Then the birth experience itself. Now we know that the factory setting of our limbic system, which I'll come on to talk about, is often determined during that birthing experience. And then the first 5 years of life, pre-verbal and verbal, are crucial, because that's when a child understands whether they are safe in their environment. And that safety is to do with food. It's to do with comfort, hugs, feeling loved, feeling nurtured, knowing that I'm safe in this environment because I'm vulnerable. I'm just a baby. I can't look after myself. And that then decides really the setting we have for our amygdalas, which I'll come on to, for the rest of our lives. And of course, our later years, our teenage years, those can also make an impact. Any adult traumas can make an impact. But ultimately, that first 5 years is crucial. And it decides the factory setting of our amygdala. So amygdala is two almond-shaped structures that sit behind our eyes that determine our emotional responses to the world. So fear, anger, shame are mediated by the amygdala. But like everything in medicine, we've separated off, okay, this is psychology, this is the amygdala over here, this is immunology over here. But in fact, the brain doesn't differentiate, because the amygdala is also involved in immune reactions and pain reactions. Because the brain says, what threats do I have? Emotional, physical, biological. What's the appropriate defensive response, including all of those factors? And therefore, we find that the amygdala is involved, and also a brain structure called the insula is involved as well. So the insula sits between the cortex and the limbic system. So some people call this limbic retraining, but essentially it's brain retraining, because the insula is not part of the limbic system. And that part of the brain takes in all the incoming information, what's going on immune-wise, nervous system-wise, processes it, and creates the appropriate immune and neurological responses. And those two brain structures, we believe, are involved in terms of this conditioning effect, this stuck effect that then decides whether we go on to having chronic conditions later in life. And they know that people who've had trauma in the first 5 to 10 years of life are twice as likely to go on to developing what we might call mainstream physiological diseases such as cancer and heart disease, but also twice as likely to get these types of chronic neuroimmune diseases like Lyme and chronic fatigue and all those types. So it's a massive risk factor in terms of past trauma that then impacts on our nervous system, that then impacts on our ability to handle threats in our environment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think about people who've had those traumatic experiences and yet somehow managed to overcome them? Like I had a neighbor in my old house, and I've always wanted to ask someone like you this question. Like, she was a Holocaust survivor, and as a child, she was in the Holocaust as a child. Now, she ended her life physically destroyed in many ways, but she lived to be 97 years old. Right. And very often you will see like people who've come from those extreme traumatic conditions somehow are very long lived. Do you think they have maybe some kind of an innate, like they manage somehow innately to reset their system, or do they somehow overcome that initial shock? Like I've always, because you would think that someone who has any of their formative years under those circumstances, and it's not just the Holocaust, like there's a million different examples of this in the world, and yet seem to go on to live like in many ways healthier lives than many other people who don't have those experiences. Do you think that there's some people somehow have an innate ability to do a reset on their own?
I think there is a multifactorial way that people handle what has happened to them. And I always say to people, you are not what happened to you. Those were experiences. And what matters is, how did your brain process those experiences? That actually goes on to determine whether you then have a long-lasting trauma response in the body or whether it's been processed. So what happens is, We've found in studies, in medical studies, that when somebody goes through trauma, a very traumatic experience, if they then have therapy or meditation or breathing or some kind of calming of the nervous system in the period of time immediately afterwards, they then have a far lower chance of going on to having trauma as a result of that experience.
Like
Long
long
lasting, which is
lasting.
why, for instance, when these days there's been a shooting or an accident, there's always trauma counselors on hand straight away, because we know that if we counsel people straight away through the experience and get them to process it as quickly as possible, then it's less likely they're going to have chronic effects from it. And
Right. Like it doesn't embed in the brain.
Because the adrenaline in the brain, they all actually stamp the memory into the brain if a person feels vulnerable as a result of experiencing that, if it's overwhelming for the system.
Right.
And so it can be, what was someone's experience straight after they experienced that trauma? Secondly, did they have a support group? Incredibly important. The reason we're seeing more trauma in society is because people have fewer and fewer people they can turn to. We're becoming more lonely in society. And we have nuclear families, because in previous generations, it was the tribe that brought up, it was the village that brought up the child. Now we have nuclear families. So there's more opportunities for trauma and lack of nurture to then occur. And then, of course, as you say, it can be, did someone go on a voyage of self-discovery? So when we go through challenges, they can go one of two ways. Either they then impact on our nervous system and our longevity, and we have these increased illnesses, etc. Or it goes the other way, where it becomes a facilitator of growth and self-awareness and self-development. And we know that if you look at people who, for instance, go on to meditation, or perhaps look at their diet and change their diet or become vegan or whatever it may be, they're often people who've been through massive challenges in their lives, and they've got to now find a solution to their dysregulation. And therefore, they may overcompensate and make sure that they're regulating their nervous system as much as possible because of what they've been through.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I know that, you will find survivors of very traumatic events who are sometimes the most positive, grateful people that you'll meet, right? Then, one person might say, oh my God, why me? I had this horrible experience, and kind of carry that horror with them for the rest of their lives. And then you'll have another person next to them who had maybe just as bad or maybe even worse experience, who somehow has found their way to feel grateful for every other minute that they have. That isn't that. And it's not, it's not an accusation or a shortcoming on the side of the person who had the trauma. Is maybe, to your point, maybe they didn't have the resources, or maybe they didn't have the same background, or maybe they weren't surrounded the same way. It's just fascinating, right? When you look at, people who come out of real adversity, who become sometimes extremely joyful, successful, and yet others just stay stuck.
You see, that's the thing. When we go through an intense challenge, if it's a little too intense, given the resources that we have, then it has the ability to bring us down and crush us mentally, physically, emotionally. But at the same time, rising from the ashes, the phoenix rising from the ashes, then becomes an opportunity to feel that strength and become stronger. So it's that strength through adversity. And then when you're older, you think, hey, I've been through hell and back. You can't stress me out. This situation is peanuts. It's nothing compared to what I've been through. And that's what, you learn to, I've handled that. Now I can handle anything.
I can do anything. Okay. So let's go back to our friends or our listeners who are dealing with intractable physiological issues. Cause I don't want to get, I can get a little caught in the esoteric sometimes. And I think that we've made the point that for people who have reasonably good health and really want to, your goal is to live this long, healthy life, this has to be an integral piece of the work that you do for yourself. And some people will have more to do, some people will have less to do, but probably we all, given the world that we live in, as you described it, which is so true, We no longer get chased by a tiger. We never know what's on the other side of the door these days. Like, it's just a constant thing. So, but let's go back to our population of people who have got a diagnosis, or they're dealing with, whether it's, and mental health is another one of these, mental health as a bucket is overflowing. Like, there's no end to the mental health issues that we're seeing. And then the physiological issues. So maybe let's go back to that world a little bit and talk about, because I can imagine there's someone listening to this who's down to eating 3 foods because everything else sends their body into a complete tailspin. And they're like, are you telling me that you just want me to think my way out of this? Like, come on, be real. That's not possible.
And we get this all the time in terms of, people say, oh, Ashok, you're saying it's in the mind. You're saying it's psychological. That's so unfair. And I say, it's not in the mind, it's in the brain. And let's differentiate those two things, because in the mind, we might think our subjective experience of consciousness or being conscious and our thoughts, and we're thinking it and we're imagining it. But of course, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that 80-90% of our brain, or our brain's capacity, is unconscious. It's not something we're consciously aware of. And that is the processing system. The central processing unit of the brain is the unconscious. And that takes care of our physiology and our immune system. And normally that's not in our control, our conscious control. But we've developed specialist tools that can regain control over those unconscious processes. Yep. And I'll give a very simple example here of how we can do that. So imagine, Natalie, you're sitting there right now. And if I said to you, it doesn't matter what you do, I can change your physiology. Doesn't matter what barriers and blocks you put up, I'm going to change your physiology within 1 minute, right? You'd be like, how are you going to do that through a screen, Ashok? Okay. So, Natalie, I want you to imagine your favorite food, the tastiest food that makes you salivate the moment you think about it. Yeah?
Okay.
And so imagine that your favorite food, and you're really hungry, is just being brought up to your mouth, and it's sitting on your tongue right now, but you can't bite into it yet. No, that favorite food is just there, and you can taste it, and you can feel the saliva in your mouth, and you're like, oh gosh, I really want to bite into it, but you're not allowed to yet. You can just feel it in your mouth, and the saliva is now flowing, wanting to just bite into that food right now. So, Natalie, let's see if we've succeeded. Do you have any excess saliva in your mouth right now? You do. Okay, great. So I was able to change the physiology.
You win.
But here's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
You knew that wasn't real. Your conscious brain knew that was not real. And yet, it didn't matter. I was able to change an aspect of your physiology. So that's an example of brain retraining, where we can train the brain into a new altered state by accessing these types of tools. And visualization and imagination is just one tool. There are many different tools that we can use to access the unconscious and train the brain out of this response. And of course, we might think, well, how are you going to stop an immune response? That's a survival response. And that's where we say the brain has these safety valves. It doesn't, not everything is purely physiological, not everything is purely emotional. Things are a combination of both. And we found these specialist ways of being able to tell the brain we are safe, and therefore it can switch off these responses. And that's how the brain retraining works. And the way to think about it is, imagine you have a river running through a field, and that is your brain's old way of responding, which is like the Army and Navy generals, that as soon as they notice anything that's threatening in the environment, they overstimulate the immune system and nervous system. Or they notice a certain food, and even a micro amount of that food they think is dangerous, so they stimulate that allergic reaction, that MCAS reaction. Now, so that's the stimulus interpretation response. Stimulus is that food or that toxin or mold or whatever. The interpretation is this is dangerous. The response is stimulate the immune system. So that's a river flowing through the ground. Now, we want to redirect that river to a different way, that we are safe. There's no longer a response that's required. But the ground is frozen. Yeah, the brain is not neuroplastic. So when we are dysregulated, our brains are not rewirable as much. So the first R of our program, we have 3 R's. The first R is relaxing the nervous system, regulating the nervous system. So that's where we use relaxation techniques, breathing techniques, meditation techniques, visualization techniques, whatever people find useful to calm the nervous system. And what that does is that loosens up the soil and makes the ground softer and more malleable. So we become more neuroplastic, more flexible. Then the second R of the program is retraining the brain, where we say, okay, now the ground is softer. Let's start digging a channel on the right-hand path, and let's redirect the water onto the right-hand path. But if we do that once, guess what? The next day when it rains, the water will kind of go back to the old pathway. So we have to use repetition. We have to keep digging the new pathway till eventually the water keeps getting redirected and it can't go down the left-hand pathway anymore because that's grown over with soil and grass, and now the water can only go along the right-hand path. So that's the retraining of the brain. The third R of the program is re-engaging with joy, which is often a missed part of medicine. But as we know from the blue zones, from longevity criteria, how you feel happy and engage with the world is incredibly important. And so a lot of our clients, they think, okay, I've retrained, great, I can go back to that 100-hour week or that crazy stress. And we say, actually, we now need to learn our stress reactions and responses. And instead of looking for joy and happiness from the outside world, we need to connect to our inner joy, the joy that's natural within us, because that's our buffer zone against stress. So we teach patients to recognize their stress reactions, and we use a lot of parts therapy and parts coaching, which we find very useful, the internal family systems type work. And then we also give people ways of engaging in self-love and self-awareness so that they can strengthen their immune system and nervous system to be strong, so that when the next threat in life comes, they've re-engaged with their inner joy. They're stronger in the face of life's adversities. And so that's the third R of the program. And so when people come onto our app, initially they can be skeptical or whatever, but when they watch the videos of people who've recovered from these illnesses and they are able to really practice it and believe in it, they get sometimes very miraculous results. Within weeks they can heal. Sometimes it takes a number of months. Sometimes it may take longer. But we say keep going until you feel it.
Well, and I would imagine that, like everything else, like what you're describing, once you relax and the way you describe that the brain now becomes softer, more malleable, I would imagine that there's a downstream effect physiologically as well, because I do think that in these extreme heightened states of stress and fear and like all of those states, frankly, even the supplements and the things that you take may not be landing.
Yeah.
Right? I would imagine that once you effectively are able to have a softening in the system and you can breathe again, even those other modalities that may still be around because you might need them for whatever reason might be more effective as you're recreating these new neural pathways.
That's absolutely right. You see, we have a lot of health practitioners we work with, and when they see someone in a dysregulated state, they say, we can't do anything with you. Go and do the Gupta program first, and then we'll do the binders and the supplements or whatever, because right now your body's just going to react to everything because it sees everything as a threat. And certainly we know from studies that with meditation and breathing techniques, the 30 to 40 inflammatory epigenetic markers are reduced just through the process of meditation. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing. Well, it is, right? I mean, if you can lengthen telomeres, it should be able to reset your genes, right?
Our telomeres are getting stronger in terms of the reduction in those telomeres. We are able to have all these beneficial effects on our physiology. Our hypertension is reduced. All of these things, all of these good effects. And essentially, what that means is that, yes, downstream, our gut benefits from that as well. Time and time again, where do people's stress go? It either goes to their head or it goes to their gut. People,
head and shoulders in the gut.
Yeah. We tend to find that, and this is coming from Ayurveda now, people who are more of what we call a Pitta temperament, which is more of the anger, kind of intensity temperament, when they get stressed, it'll go to their head. They'll get head and shoulders getting tightened and stressed. People who are more for the Vata, air elements, they will get stress going straight to their stomach, and they'll get dysbiosis, they'll get tension in the stomach, they'll get diarrhea, constipation, because that's where stress literally goes, like an energetic field goes into their gut. And so when we do meditation, breathing, relaxation, we recommend the one from the Art of Living Foundation. When you do that, you calm down these areas, and then your system can do what it's designed to do when you get your mind out of the way. Your body can actually heal incredibly well when you get your mind out of the way.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I don't always say it. I don't think I've articulated it that way, but I do believe that if we can remove the obstacles, the body's ability to heal and repair itself is unmatched. And it doesn't mean you'll never need some outside help, but I do think that we have this. I mean, the fact that we're able to live and exist is nothing short of a miracle, right? Like the number of chemical reactions and processes and cellular pathways and whatnot that are happening every second of every minute of every hour of every day, even in the sickest people.
Absolutely.
It's not something that we can recreate.
And Natalie, like we started our conversation, this system has survived for millions of years. It's got all of that knowledge, all of that ability to adapt to our environment, to survive in the face of bacterial infections and viruses. The only difference now is we're not giving it the best chance of being able to perform its functions because we're dysregulating it through our incessant need for financial accumulation or incessant need for social media status or whatever our personal stress is that stresses us out, whatever is our want in life. It then dysregulates the system, this finely tuned system, and then it can't do its work effectively. And of course, it's multifactorial. So yes, there's stress, there's how much time we spend on a screen, there's then the toxins that we ingest. Exercise or physical activity is a huge one. And one of the biggest factors, I believe, is sleep. I believe a good, deep night's sleep has the ability to heal so many different conditions. But when the amygdala and insular parts of our brain perceive threat, why would they let you have a deep night's sleep? Right?
No. Keep an eye out.
It's not going to let you have that deep sleep. So often people say, Ashok, how can I have a good night's sleep? I say, it starts with what you do when you're waking. And if you can regulate your nervous system, and then especially after dinner is the absolute crucial piece. If you meditate before dinner, breathe and meditate before dinner, eat your dinner slowly, and then after dinner, don't go on to working or being on active screens. Like a baby that needs that relaxation time, relax your nervous system after dinner. So you've got that slow wind down to sleep at about 10:30 or so. That's the best way of getting a good night's sleep versus thinking, well, maybe I need to do this or maybe I need to do that or whatever. The nervous system daytime regulation will help you have a better night's sleep. That will heal and repair everything in your body. Give it the chance.
Yeah. No, I could not agree with you more. I mean, this whole, it's interesting. We moved into a new house last year and the TV is now in the basement. And so you have to make an effort to go to the basement to watch TV. And I would say that in the past year, I don't know. Like I couldn't count you. Like maybe I've watched 10% of the TV shows I've ever watched. And so after dinner becomes a different experience. The challenge is, to your point, staying off the computer, staying off social media, and, for the love that all that is holy, staying off the news in any way, shape, or form, right? And when I try to talk to people about that, but they're like, but we need to know what's going on. Like, you need to know what's happening in the world. I'm like, yeah, but I don't need to know it now.
Yes.
Right. Like you're denying your body, yourself, the ability, to your point, to get out of this heightened state of hypervigilance.
It creates a lack of safety. What do? We have dinner. And then, as you say, we go on our screens. So comparing ourselves to all these successful people around us. And then we watch the evening news, where the evening news essentially, right, for 30 minutes, we're going to find all the worst things that have happened on this planet to the 8 billion people on this planet. And we're going to feed it to you in an emotionally triggering and dramatic way. And then they say, right, don't have nightmares, off to bed.
Night.
And that's the worst for the nervous system. Yeah. So we definitely recommend people, if you're catching up on news, read it, don't watch it. Because the purpose of news channels is to stimulate your nervous system, because then you're more likely to tune in. There's an addiction that they create there. So read about the news. You can keep yourself informed, and reading is a bit more of a neutral experience versus the sounds and the music and the clashing that you see on TV. So you can still keep yourself informed for sure.
Yeah, but I would stay. I mean, personally, like I do think that, in the couple hours before you go to bed would be the worst time to inform yourself about what's happening in the world. Just because you're, and you've mentioned this before, like the subconscious is the driver of what's happening in your body, and you're now feeding that subconscious a whole lot of information that it's going to have to process.
And the fundamental thing there is safety. Compared to previous generations, we do not feel as existentially safe in the world than we used to. And I believe, controversially, that this happened, and if we look at the graphs of anxiety and depression, this happened when mass social media became available on phones. So what happened is pre-2009, 2010, if you wanted to go onto Facebook or whatever, you had to go onto your laptop, turn it on, go to the website, have a look. And these things were a part of our lives, but they weren't in your face every moment. And the moment that social media got onto phones and we could access them instantly on smartphones, this is about 2010, 2011. You look at the graphs of anxiety, depression, or mental illness, it all started going up at that point in time. Absolutely coincided with that and continued. And then it got even worse after COVID, or during and after COVID. So a lot of our mental health challenges are because this sensitive, vulnerable mind of ours is now being bombarded with all the news around the world, all the chaos around the world, overstimulated with information, and obviously then this comparison, comparing ourselves to others around us, and the anger that's generating. So social media is generating these echo chambers of anger and frustration with the world, and that's going on to creating an existential feeling of a lack of safety. And that's why so many people say, oh, I wouldn't bring a person into this world. I wouldn't bring a child into this world. And yet, at all criteria that you look at, we live the longest, the healthiest. We live like kings now than we ever did compared to any previous generations. We have so many life opportunities. This is the best world that's ever been created for children to be brought into. The challenge is the mental health component of it because of the way that we are living life.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so. And so, yeah, exactly. Guys, are you listening? Are you taking notes? This is gold. So if you were going to, you've got an incredibly robust website. You've got really robust programs. You have a clinic, but you were telling me about something really exciting, talking about getting on phones. But maybe the only reason you should get on your phone.
We can't beat them, join them is the way that we look at it. So,
well, let's create a better destination on the phone.
Let's give them something more positive and uplifting to experience. So yes, Natalie, we have something called Daily Gupta Size. Okay. And this is completely free to anybody on the planet through our app. What these are daily Zoom calls with our trained coaches. So we have 20 to 30 trained coaches around the world. And these live Zoom calls, Monday to Friday, go through somatic experiencing somatic techniques, breathing and meditation or relaxation for 25 minutes. You can actually join for 15 minutes, so 15 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on how much time you have.
That's pretty manageable.
Every day.
Yeah.
And then we have 200 to 300 people on those events. And they just feel this intense relaxation afterwards. Like this is the greatest start to their day. And something not to be underestimated is the power of group intention. So when you meditate on your own or breathe on your own or relax, that has a certain great benefit. But when you do it in community, in a group, depending on your belief system, you have a bigger piped connection to source, to that love, whatever you want to call life. And therefore it magnifies the power and depth of your experience. And that's what a lot of our clients say. And so we'd love for people to join us. It's free every weekday morning, and it starts at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern. So it's in that time period. And for UK, it's 3 o'clock, Europe, 4 o'clock. So anyone on the planet can, or most of the people in the Western world certainly can join at those times. And it's just a great way to start your day, great way to regulate your nervous system. And that's what we'd love people to experience.
Just to at least get a toehold in this whole world, right?
Absolutely. And of course, that's our free offering. And we have lots of videos. So if people do have a chronic illness, we have lots of videos and audios that people can watch to learn more about their condition. And if they choose to actually go on to then taking our brain retraining program, it's a 6-month program of videos, audios, weekly webinars, and also daily Gupta Size for brain retraining. So you have daily Gupta Size for nervous system regulation and daily Gupta Size for brain retraining. And so it's a whole ecosystem of support. And as people know, we've done lots of studies on this, but until we get the independent large-scale phase 3 data, phase 3 trial data, we offer a 1-year money-back guarantee on our program. So people have got nothing to lose by giving this a shot, because we want to reach as many people as possible to be open to this type of approach and see the benefits.
I love that. And so for the Gupta program, the 6-month program, is that with a coach or is that as a community? How does that work
exactly? That is in community. So when people take that 6-month program,
it is in
they
community.
have the weekly webinars where we have community breakout rooms. They'll have buddy support. They'll have the daily Gupta size and all the videos and audios, and all within an app, because when it's in an app, it's so much easier to access than having to go into a membership area on your laptop. So people find that really powerful as well.
Well, yeah, as you said, it's that phone is insidiously with you every minute of every hour of every day at this point. So may as well capitalize on it and make it easier for people.
I've seen parents get more anxious about losing their phones than if they lost their kid.
Okay, well, that's a little crazy, but yeah. And if the kid's holding the phone, well, it's game over. Ashok, this has been a great, very refreshing conversation. I really, I appreciate the work that you're doing. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think that this is such a crucial piece of the puzzle, and it's always been important, but I think it's even more important now than it's ever been, as the world just seems to heat up and ramp up and wind up, and everything's up. So I mean, maybe just if you could leave the audience, other than doing their daily Gupta size, which I think would be a really good place to start. If you have a couple of 1 or 2 ideas to leave people with, and then let's tell people where they can find you or your work and the website.
So I think the daily Gupta size or just regular meditation. Yeah. And I know a lot of people love meditation. A lot of people really have a resistance to meditation. Oh, I can't meditate. Oh, I don't I want to do that. And I would say you can even let go of labels. Don't even call it meditation. Just the opportunity each day to sit with yourself for 20 minutes, just going inwards, just noticing what's going on in your body, just breathing. You don't need to label it as meditation, but just taking that time out for yourself is so important in our modern world. That self-care. And you can do it on your own. We also have lots of free meditations in our app that people can use, but just invest in that. And I'll leave you with one final statistic, which I find incredible. So an amazing study done by Harvard in 2015, which should have been front page news around the world. Yeah. They did a study on meditation, and it was the largest study ever done. They followed people for a year in terms of how many times they visited a doctor or a hospital or had an intervention. They then taught them meditation and some resilience skills. And they practiced that meditation for at least once a day for then a year. And they tracked them for that year in terms of, once again, how many times did they see a doctor or a hospital. And they also had a control group. So they had 2 control groups. There was a 42% reduction in billable contact hours with hospitals or a doctor. This is a published study.
That's shocking.
And the numbers of people who were in the active group was 5,000 people, and the control group, I believe, had about 11,000 people. So we aren't talking a small little study. That was the most incredible study I've ever read. And we're all talking about how do we reduce healthcare costs, how do we get people well, etc. Literally, that study is sitting there, and I'll send it to you, Natalie. And I just think if people just embraced this in healthcare systems and made it the first priority, for the whole planet should be meditating. The proof is in. We would.
But you would think that insurance companies would give you a break on your insurance if you meditate.
Exactly. So it's incredible that we have this free resource with us every moment. But what's different to traditional healthcare, or what we call sickness care, is it does require your time of investment. It's an investment in your own health, but it will pay dividends. And not only will meditation make you physiologically heal, it will also help you mentally, make you happier. It's a win-win.
Love it. I love it. All right. What's the name of the app? What's the website? Tell people where to go. Where do they find all this?
So you can go to our website, which is guptaprogram.com. So GUPTA, guptaprogram.com. Or what's even easier is you can go to App Store or Play Store, and type in Gupta Program Brain Retraining, or just type in Gupta Program, you'll see it on there. You can download the free app, and within minutes, you can be finding resources that can help you meditate, breathe, relax your nervous system, and it's all free. Yeah. And then obviously people go on to the larger program. There's a paid program as well. But just a lot of people, thousands of people just use the free version and get so much out of it. So we'd love for people to experience that.
I love it. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming, and obviously the incredible work that you do.
Thank you, Natalie. It's been a joy.